pleasure to introduce Dr. Anthony Pratcher II. Dr. Pratcher is a lecturer and honors faculty fellow at Barrett, the Honors College of Arizona State University. He earned a bachelor's degree in history from Howard University and a PhD in American history from the University of Pennsylvania. His scholarship uses oral interviews, census data, and archival collections, including from the Arizona Historical Society, to explore how urban policies influence community formation in the metropolitan Southwest. He also serves on the board for the George Washington Carver Museum and Cultural Center in Phoenix. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Pratcher share his talk, Diggin in the Crates, the Role of Community Archives in Suburban History. Dr. Pratcher?
Thank you, David. I very much appreciate that introduction. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin by sharing with you my screen. All right. Uh-oh. It says my screen sharing is being paused. Can you all see what it is that I have to share?
No, it's not. It's not showing up on our end.
It's just dark.
Oh, there it goes.
And there we go.
There we go.
All right. I have written comments. So good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be able to share my research with you all today. I've spent most of my adult life in the collections like those over at Papago Park, seeking to understand the history of Central Arizona. So this journey has taken me farther than I ever could have imagined. My academic career has taken me from Glendale to Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Providence, Pittsburgh. But every summer, our local archival collections pulled me back home to brave the heat so I could keep digging into the crates, to use a colloquial term. I first encountered the story of Maryvale Hospital in the Arizona room at Burton Barr Public Library. It was not until I found myself in the small archival collections at the Glendale Arizona Historical Society that I was really able to understand why the story mattered so much. There, I was gifted access to the personal records of Byron Peck, former mayor of Glendale and former administrator at Northwest Hospital, now known as Banner Thunderbird. He left his daughter with paperwork that commemorated his family's service at the hospital. Before, when I was thinking of the way that community hospitals operated in the West Valley in particular, this was merely a story of economic development. You know, you all will see as there was blood, sweat, tears, energy, passion, care that Peck, his wife, his mother, and their close friends, they all poured into Northwest Hospital as unpaid volunteers. Once I saw that, I began to realize the story I was telling had far deeper social implications than economic development. What I'm attempting to describe is how the process of economic development within our community, what we see as social capital, the ties that bind communities together through voluntary mutual aid, it serves as an accelerant for local investment in the suburban Sunbelt, in the communities and the neighborhoods that we all live in. So moreover, I came to understand this through archival research. It's been by going through the personal records left in the attics, garages, and offices of suburban pioneers that I've been able to understand the transformation of the Salt River Valley in this way. So I'd argue that the billions in revenue created by suburban development occurs because of how we, those of us who are living here, create community in our social lives. We can create better institutions if we understand the history of our community. So with that, let's begin. Peggy Schaefer did not work outside of her home until she joined the Women's Auxiliaries at Maryvale Samaritan Hospital. She was quickly promoted to a managerial position in the gift shop, where her business acumen helped raise $35,000. Good Samaritan, the regional health care network that owned Maryvale Hospital, would have needed around 15 full-time staff to replicate women auxiliaries labor at this institution. However, aside from a staff liaison, Good Samaritan paid none of the women's auxiliaries for their works. Volunteers had always been a part of the Maryvale Hospital staff, as community residents donated both time and money to establish healthcare facilities in the neighborhood. Their unwaged labor had proved essential to hospital operations over the years. When asked her thoughts on unwaged labor, Schaefer replied, "People are always asking me, if you do this job so well, then why don't you get a paying job? But I enjoy volunteering. I like helping people." While volunteer work pleased Schaefer, many of her colleagues felt that gender discrimination had limited their employment opportunities to unwaged labor, and none received the institutional influence granted women's auxiliaries when Maryvale Hospital opened in 1961. So let's begin with the literature review. In the post-war period, women's auxiliaries represented the public interest at voluntary, also what we would call nonprofit hospitals. Rosemary Stevens argues that these smaller hospitals represented the belief that change could be accomplished in the hospital system at the local level through good faith efforts of responsible citizens. She found that by 1960, more than 1 million women's auxiliaries staffed hospital wards, operated gift shops, or greeted patients, and that these volunteers, mostly teenagers and homemakers from nearby communities, developed, quote, fealty to their hospital, accentuating its individual identity and binding its ties to local networks, end quote. At the same time, though, there were new stakeholders in American healthcare, such as health insurers, hospital developers, or consumer advocates. These new stakeholders reduced the influence of women's auxiliaries at community hospitals. Due to the financial influence of commercial interests, they became afterthoughts for hospital administrators, while in contrast, bondholders, a specific class that also blurs the line between a proprietary and charitable interest, they became better positioned to represent the public in community healthcare. So in the United States, hospitals take one of three corporate forms, either public, proprietary, for-profit, or voluntary, which is nonprofit. While the healthcare industry has grappled with rising costs basically for the last century, volunteer networks helped bind community hospitals to charitable societies, and cities use property tax exemptions to subsidize these facilities as an alternative to public healthcare. Scholars have shown how community hospitals were central beneficiaries from post-war reforms and federal hospital development policies. Scholars have focused on things such as the Hospital Survey Act and Construction Act of 1946, known as the Hill-Burton Act, to understand how nonprofit healthcare drove post-war economic development. This seminal legislation, along with private insurance, minimized the development of proprietary hospitals in the post-war period. However, scholars such as Elizabeth Tandy Shermer have also shown how Arizona was a forerunner in the use of municipal bonds for industrial development. Similarly, private investors purchased mortgage bonds to finance Arizona's community hospitals. So Maryvale Hospital, and more succinctly, the experience of women's auxiliaries, shows how proprietary interest could exploit volunteer labor to gain a foothold in our healthcare system. Now, healthcare, like most public necessities, has historically been underfunded in Arizona. And while the territorial government did not develop adequate healthcare services for public use, voluntary societies emerged to help provide private communities with medical care. So St. Luke's, the oldest voluntary hospital in the valley, was founded on this basis when businessmen sponsored an Episcopalian cleric seeking, quote, to heal the sick without regard to race, creed, or station in life, end quote. I believe St. Luke's opens in 1908. It was sponsored and bankrolled by the publisher of the largest newspaper in the state. He was a trustee for the facility, and his wife was a charter member on a women's auxiliaries entitled the Board of Visitors. Moreover, Josephine Williams Goldwater, mother to Barry Goldwater, she was also a member of the Board of Visitors. Their annual charity ball raised nearly 10% of the initial hospital endowment, and moreover, drove members to join the volunteer labor force. By the 1950s, St. Luke's Charity Ball was a civic institution that regularly raised more than $25,000 towards the capital campaign for the hospital. And in 1951, their president was elected chairman of the board for Phoenix Memorial Hospital. Now, suburbanization created new frontiers in community healthcare. Prior to this time, most of the voluntary hospitals in the valley were located in central Phoenix. You have St. Joe's, St. Luke's, Good Samaritan, Phoenix General Hospital. They're all within Phoenix city limits. But West Valley residents, they would have to head into Phoenix if they needed hospital care. By the 50s, though, the Glendale Chamber saw a need for community health care as thousands of new homes were sprouting in the surrounding agricultural hinterland. According to records at the Glendale Arizona Historical Society, there have been previous attempts to develop a local hospital, but they had all failed due to, quote, apathy and lack of cooperation on the part of doctors and most of the residents of Glendale. In 1957, Michael Wachner and Charles Crone, two hospital developers from Southern Arizona, advanced the Glendale Chamber 35,000 to 5 acres from Ruth Waite. However, the nonprofit hospital board, led by the wife of Glendale Chamber president, disbanded once they realized there would not be Hill Burton funds available for construction. Undeterred, Glendale Mayor Byron Peck joined with several leading businessmen to pursue a private alternative, interest-bearing bonds sold to local investors. Leaders in the Phoenix Chamber of Commerce loudly advocated for security regulators to allow Arizona banks to offer interest-bearing bonds on behalf of nonprofit corporations. Mortgage bonds forced community hospitals to prioritize proprietary aspects of their charitable mission and granted investors influence over hospital boards. These attractive investments with low default rates due to perpetual revenue would eventually burgeon into a $500 billion hospital construction financing bond market at the national level. But first, at the local level, Arizonans had to be convinced that hospital mortgage bonds were a worthy investment. Maricopa County proved surprisingly disinterested in the utility of these investments. Peck believed that the voluntary hospitals, quote, fear the competition from new hospitals, and convinced local professionals that community hospitals were being led by, again, quote, a bunch of crooks. Peck asked Glendale medical doctors to get behind this effort and put it across, as he said, lest we shut our eyes as we've done before and let someone else do it. And he pleaded with community residents to, quote, dig into their funds to help with the hospital bond sales. Crone hired Gloria Hale to sell bonds while he set up the nonprofit corporation. And while donations from local corporations like First National Bank, APS, and SRP helped raise enough funds to begin construction, this momentum waned as local investors saw financial turmoil at nearby community hospitals. So in 1960, Peck's wife, along with the wives of his colleague, helped form a women's auxiliaries at Northwest Hospital. A trained official from another hospital met to detail what procedures would be necessary to incorporate an auxiliary and how that organization would benefit Northwest Hospital. One of their primary purposes would be to create good public relations and community understanding between the hospital and the surrounding area. At the time, there were around $500,000 in outstanding mortgage bonds that needed to be sold. So when the auxiliary formed, their initial efforts, as noted in their bylaws, could be distilled down to buy a bond or sell one. Auxiliary leaders recruited go-getters to circulate word among club women and publish newspaper editorials exhorting community members to purchase bonds. They also helped with the bond sale thermometer that advertised how many bonds had been sold. In conclusion, when the hospital was finally built, it was said that full credit must be given to the women of the auxiliary during this time, for without their untiring efforts, the hospital might possibly not have become a reality. So as the thermometer rose, more citizens showed their desire to purchase bonds, which indicated, according to the papers left at Glendale Arizona Historical Society, which indicated that the community had complete confidence in their leaders. Eventually, Northwest Hospital opens in September of 1960. So what Northwest Hospital does is prove that mortgage debt could provide a market-based solution to community healthcare. Maryvale, which is south of Glendale, wound up becoming much larger than the small town to the north of it when residents first moved there. But when they first moved there, when people first moved to Maryvale in 1955, 1956, the community was so underdeveloped that they couldn't even get access to telephone lines. So Gerald Daly, one of the first members of the Maryvale Hospital Board, he recalled that John Long, the developer of Maryvale, wanted to build parks and swimming pools and other things for the community, but they had not been forthcoming. So he said that if we incorporated as a community organization, that he would give us a community center. Maryvale social clubs raised funds for myriad necessities in suburban life, like community centers or child care clinics, So it came as no surprise when several community organizations joined forces on the Maryvale Siesta Hospital Planning Board to create the Maryvale Hospital. While public resources had not been forthcoming, John F. Long connected community leaders with private creditors who presented a similar deal as Glendale had received with Northwest Hospital. So mortgage debt, along with community effort, would develop healthcare in Maryvale. Daly and his fellow directors followed Glendale's strategy to raise the capital necessary for hospital construction. Long highlighted development plans and promotional materials for Maryvale, while newspapers ran human interest articles on construction progress. And most importantly, there were the advertisements for hospital mortgage bonds. For months, years, Arizonans were told your money can earn 100% or more through the purchase of bonds via mail at the construction site or at a Midtown Phoenix sales office. Moreover, the Maryvale Women's Club created a social calendar around development, as dances, variety hours, dinner plays, they were all organized to raise proceeds for hospital construction. These events entertained community residents and provided salesmen with opportunities to pitch interest-bearing bonds to the broader public. Maryvale Hospital was promoted to the public by Hudson L. McGuire, a wartime naval officer married to a Hollywood starlet, and California developer Theodore Shostak. Their venture, Universal Development Company, had incorporated in Iowa, but won contracts to develop several community hospitals after Shostak became the president of Hospital Developers of Arizona. Their promotion was highlighted by claims that their salesmen could sell $500,000 in mortgage bonds monthly. And this activity, it helped boost real estate development in the area. Homeowners, they would advertise proximity to Maryvale Hospital when selling neighborhood property, while builders leased nearby land to build medical centers. When the hospital finally opened, John F. Long crowed, "It has been my pleasure to plan for the location well in advance of actual need and to make the land available to a responsible organization and to cooperate with them through construction." Hospital promoters also proved highly appreciative of the Women's Auxiliaries. McGuire recognized auxiliary leaders for their long and tireless service without thought of compensation, while Long thanked Maryvale residents who, quote, wholeheartedly supported the hospital through bond purchases, fund drives, cake sales, and by their contributions in time to develop a fine facility brought about by community effort. John Long would later recall that in the early 60s, there was a severe recession. Employment dropped. A lot of the people that moved here and then lost their jobs wherever they were working were no longer able to they couldn't make their payments, and they moved out and the houses went into repossession, end quote. So similarly, community hospitals fell short of the promoted revenue projections, and they struggled to meet their financial obligations. Peck had been a leading supporter of Northwest Hospital, but believed that the nonprofit board had been victimized after seeing contractors make changes to, quote, suit themselves and promoters misrepresent hospital equipment quality. Money, drugs, and equipment disappear from the facility as hospital revenue struggled to break even. So to help, Women's Auxiliaries donated more than $15,000 in hospital equipment and convinced local women's clubs to donate furnishings for hospital bedrooms. At Northwest Hospital, the Peck family had risked their family standing, convincing their neighbors to invest. Financial bankruptcy at the hospital would threaten social bankruptcy for his family, I argue. Peck eventually left public office so he could administer Northwest Hospital, compelled by, quote, an obligation to make the hospital pay so that the good people of Glendale who had purchased bonds would not lose faith in me, and those who had worked so diligently to make it possible to have a hospital in Glendale would be rewarded for their efforts. His family story shows how Women's Auxiliaries towed this line between workers and investors. Now, a similar story can be told in Maryvale. Women's Auxiliaries raised several $1,000s from rummage sale for hospital equipment after upper management failed to deliver promised materials before fleeing the city. But Maryvale did not have a Byron Peck, an elected official with deep connections in the surrounding community. So community leaders resigned from the board and Maryvale Hospital fell under the direction of an affiliated physician. At this time, Phoenix had become home to a gaggle of ambitious developers like David H. Murdoch, who later went on to become a billionaire CEO of Dole Food Company. And he leveraged, at others as well, leveraged their success as builders into more complex business arrangements. So Murdoch, he's important to our story because he starts Union Title Company to finance his real estate developments. And by the early 60s, this firm had grown into one of the largest mortgage title companies in the state. Union Title served as a trustee at several community hospitals across Maricopa County and insisted that their boards, these nonprofit boards, seat representatives from Union Title to, quote, protect the interests of the bondholders. Community members had to fight mortgage trustees for control over hospital operations. In Scottsdale, Union Title sought control of a hospital board after it missed a payment to bondholders. A company executive was installed as chairman with plans to lease facilities to the Baptist Hospital Association of Arizona. Wachner and Crone, the friends of the Glendale Chamber, joined the Scottsdale chamber in a suit to prevent Union Title from placing their representative on the board. Their representative's testimony demonstrates how commercial interests could pervade the nonprofit nature of community healthcare. He said that he never read the bylaws of the nonprofit board and claimed that he had no idea how much the hospital paid Union Title and administrative fees, even though he led the division with their contract. It required strong leadership to prevent proprietary interests from taking advantage of stressful and chaotic situations, such as the distressing financial situation which community hospitals were finding themselves in. So there was a trade group sponsored by the voluntary hospitals that entered this vacuum by litigating consumer complaints against community hospitals. Walter Chiefitz, attorney for the Arizona Hospital Association, argued that community hospitals were being illegally organized as nonprofits because, as he quipped, does anyone seriously argue that these bond sale promoters are in it for their health? He sued board members for incorporating nonprofit corporations with, quote, the express purpose of evading the Arizona Security Act by claiming an exemption for the sale of securities. And he alleged that they had not been incorporated for charitable purposes, but, quote, for the personal, private, and pecuniary profit of its promoters. He represented bondholders who felt defrauded due to misleading statements and omissions of material facts and believed that community hospitals would, quote, place a burden on the sick when they could least afford it. These cases show how bondholders became representatives for the public interest because they had litigation rights, which volunteer workers did not. Now, Northwest Hospital went with Valley National Bank as their bondholder trustee. And before they negotiated a sale to Good Samaritan, now Banner Health Hospital, they were offered a 15-year mortgage in lieu of bankruptcy. But Maryvale Hospital had Union Title as a trustee. So West Valley hardware store owner Walter Grzinski formed the Arizona Bondholders Committee to rally bondholders behind the Maryvale Hospital board after Union Title began bankruptcy proceedings. He said, quote, we must see that the hospital is allowed to operate without pressure or adverse publicity. Forcing it to go through court proceedings now will mean a great loss to all investors, end quote. He went further to say that, quote, since Union Title and Trust have no capital investment in the hospital, we, as investors and not the trust officer, should determine if the hospital should go into receivership or bankruptcy. Women's auxiliaries, who work thousands of unwaged hours to provide labor that the hospital could not afford to pay, they were not included in this discourse. While their efforts would prove to stave off bankruptcy from Union Title, local bondholders were the only parties with legal protections to challenge proprietary interests. Now, Maryvale Hospital reoriented towards profitability under the administration of Preston Powell, a Navy veteran from rural Arizona. His leadership led to heightened morale among hospital employees and women auxiliaries. But a Dallas couple, Dallas, Texas, sued Maryvale Hospital in federal court, alleging that they had been sold unregistered bonds based on, quote, untrue statements of material facts. And they doubted that the board of the Maryvale Hospital would be able to repay. In a shocking twist, they gained support from a former director who claimed that he had been, quote, duped and deceived by hospital promoters and sought more than $2 million in damages for his ridicule and humiliation. He claimed that hospital promoters had collectively engaged in fraudulent activities, quote, through a number of corporations created in several states and entering into a series of agreements with themselves, and pleaded ignorance due to his inability to access information on bond sales or construction schedules. Shortly after, Union Title filed suit in Arizona Superior Court to put the hospital into receivership in order to preserve its assets. During the lawsuit, Powell had apocryphally argued that there is some parties or parties behind the scenes making every effort to gain control of this hospital. Ronald Wilpitz, the director of Marcus J. Lawrence Hospital in Yavapai County, he was appointed trustee by a federal judge the following year, and his first course of action was to fire Powell. For women's auxiliaries, this proved to be the final straw. Their president, Anna Cohn, had become well respected across Maryvale for her dedication to volunteer work. And she had every reason to assume that this entreaty would be taken seriously by hospital administrators. She admitted that morale among volunteers had fallen to a low ebb when she sent written protests demanding to know what engineered the removal. In response, Wilpitz glibly replied, that would be hard to say. One might say diverse interests, doctors, shareholders, who knows, end quote. That was a quote in the newspaper. He argued that Powell had been an able administrator and issued a statement which claimed that, quote, the dismissal was certainly not a reflection of Mr. Powell, but due to differences of judgment, which Wilpitz characterized as a business judgment of trustee, end quote. So in this sense, while these two communities shouldn't be seen as mutually exclusive, bondholders superseded women's auxiliaries in voluntary healthcare. And I do argue this because what we see in the early 50s is women's auxiliaries being promoted to being chair people of hospitals, you know? But by the 1960s, with the advent of proprietary interests in nonprofit healthcare, women's auxiliaries as workers can't get a meeting with an administrator or with a trustee when an administrator has been fired. So in just 15 years, you see a really dramatic shift of power away from the women who are volunteering and working there to, in many ways, the men who are representing the financial interests of the public. That being said, I do think we need to remember that these two groups are often interrelated, as we see with Peck and his family. His wife, his mother, they were members of the women's auxiliaries as well, and he was an administrator on the board. So in this case, I think what we wind up seeing is the way that the labor of a class became significantly less important than their financial investment. That's what I have right now. But let me move to the conclusion, wrap this up. Maryvale Hospital was reconstructed under Chapter 10 of the Federal Bankruptcy Act as in 1965, once Medicare money arrived. And so the facility became productive enough to pay bondholders some of the interest owed. In July of 65, a federal judge approved a 2% payment to bondholders, followed by a 3% payment in November and a 5% payment in 1966. While the aggregate debt remained outstandingly high, the hospital had a net cash balance and began to reinvest in design upgrades. Receivership delivered Maryvale Hospital cash reserves and a 25% increase in patient visits. So by 1967, Lutheran Hospitals and Homes Society of Fargo, North Dakota, an entity with more than 80 facilities across the nation, they sought to acquire Maryvale Hospital after purchasing the similarly distressed Mesa Lutheran Hospital. Soon after that, the Sisters of Benedict from Ferdinand, Indiana, they also tried to purchase Maryvale Hospital, but after a bidding war, Good Samaritan, now Banner Health, purchased Maryvale Hospital for $5 million in 1968. So the sacrifices of women's auxiliaries, they kept Maryvale Hospital running until it could finally become a financial success. In 1971, the Maricopa County Comprehensive Health Planning Council, the CHPC, found that relationships between local hospitals and their surrounding communities had really been altered because of the removal of women's auxiliaries from hospital operations. One report argued, quote, "A hospital is a community facility held in trust for the public. How this is done without a free and open dialogue between the staff of the institution and the administration is beyond me. How this can be accomplished without open discussions with planning groups within the community is a singular concern. That the community is uninvolved is a betrayal of responsibility," end quote. To ensure systemic stability, patient expenses rose at Maryvale Hospital after it was purchased by Good Samaritan. Some of this was due to inflation, but it was also a way to balance costs throughout the regional system. In 1973, the CHPC denied a request by Good Samaritan to raise rates at the hospital. However, Good Samaritan recently opened a hospital in Mesa with projected deficits of around 1.5 million, and they needed additional revenue to repay bond members. The CHPC argued that it was not fair to patients to raise rates at the Maryvale Samaritan Hospital since it was already profitable as an independent facility. But in the end, as part of the corporate conglomerate, the corporate healthcare conglomerate, rates at Maryvale Samaritan went up, and the CHPC was excluded from future rate hike conversations. Women's auxiliaries, they continue to volunteer at community hospitals, as people like Peggy Schaefer show, but their activities trended more towards social events, and they were no longer reflected the influence which volunteers had previously held. Instead, bondholders and their interests became representatives of what the public good is in community healthcare, and their profitability became the determinant for success. Thank you all. I appreciate your attention during this presentation. I hope that you found it interesting. If you have, I'm looking forward to any questions that you all may have for me.
Thank you very much, Anthony. That was fantastic. Well, we have a few minutes for questions for Dr. Pratcher. So If we have any questions, please post them in the chat. I'll get things kicked off. I guess I had a question about how much this story that you told us today is unique to the Phoenix metro area, or do we see similar trends playing out across other growing urban areas in the West or maybe other areas of the country?
I think that this story is certainly, it's a Phoenix story, but it's indicative of the development of healthcare across the country. One of the things that you see within urban history is this description of a meds and eds economic model. You see it in particular in Rust Belt cities. So there's been a lot of literature on places like Pittsburgh, in particular, looking at their economic resurgence in the last part of the 20th century and how it's tied to healthcare development. So I think when we look at the Rust Belt in some ways as a foil to the Sun Belt, what we then wind up seeing is that policies, practices that emerge here in the 60s, they make their way up north during the 70s and 80s. And so you wind up having this longer sort of national discussion on the way of that healthcare can drive economic development. But I do think that you find the origins of these policies and practices in the Phoenix area. This is the earliest I've seen this specific type of investment.
Okay, really interesting. It looks like we don't have any questions yet, but maybe a few comments. Let me see, Linda Winokur said, Dr. Pratcher has established a firm foundation to study hospital development in Arizona. Did you know we have St. Luke's as well as their Women's Auxiliary Hospital visitor records at the AHS archives in Tempe?
I did not know that, thank you. Can't wait to look at them.
We have another comment from Christine Larson. I loved hearing the power of women. I'm researching the same story in the community in Buckeye. So please, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat. I guess I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the collections that you looked at. I was particularly interested about the one at the local historical society in Glendale, Arizona. Could you talk a little bit about what's there? Yeah.
So Glendale, Arizona, it's an interesting historical society. And I think I'm not totally sure what the relationship is between AHS and the local societies, but I found that they're really great for doing community-based research in the sense that what you find there are the records of people who may not, how am I trying to say it? They matter locally. They matter at a neighborhood sort of level. You'll find yearbooks there. You'll find records from some of the local clubs. I do want to say, yeah, there might be some women's clubs records there. Lots of old newspapers for sure. But what you find are records left by the community institutions. They'll have index files where they'll index by topic and you're able to see what goes on at this sort of grassroots level. And the reason I think this really matters though is when we are talking about academic histories, it's often at 30,000 feet. And it's very difficult to do suburban history from that level. So much of what goes on in suburbs is granular and repetitive, but because of that, it allows you to look at the way that policies at a federal level are implemented at the hyper-local level. So by going into these, community archives effectively with records that are just left by people who are almost, amateur historians, people who just care about preserving the stories in their neighborhood, what you wind up finding is the connection between the meta narrative and the individual experience. So I really do recommend people going and just seeing what's stored at their local community archive just to get a sense of the neighborhoods that they're living in. So what I've found is a much greater sense of connection to the people around me and to the broader stories of this country by seeing these records in such a personal and intimate type of way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Looks like we have another comment from Linda. St. Luke's was the first hospital in Arizona and one of the first in the nation to be purchased by a nonprofit out-of-state corporation. Okay, thank you, Linda. Maybe perhaps you could tell us a little bit about, I know you're revising your dissertation to hopefully be published as a book, but I also noticed that you're working on a new project as well, which is pretty amazing that you're juggling two large projects like that. I wonder if you could maybe just give us a little information on those two projects.
Yeah, so my dissertation was a study of Phoenix. It was a study of municipal annexation primarily, and looking at the way in which that specific urban policy helps the city grow. It took a very circuitous route, but I got involved in a specific discourse surrounding settler colonialism. And so understanding the way that urban annexation can be used to dispossess communities of color of political sovereignty and the land that accompanies that. That story is in many ways near and dear to my heart. But after seeing the unrest last year, after the deaths of Deon Johnson and George Floyd, I really wanted to work on an African-American history for Phoenix and really for the broader Southwest. Phoenix is, Arizona has a very under-researched, under-theorized African-American experience. We have the largest Black population in the West outside of Texas and California, which in some ways makes sense. But when you think of the fact that there are many other metropolitan communities, Albuquerque, Denver, Seattle, with longer, in many ways, Black histories, what we have here is a whole bunch of people who's kind of showed up at once without necessarily having a way of determining where we're all coming out of. So I've spent the last year trying to go through, and I'm calling it searching for my people, but really search to see where I can find African Americans represented in the Phoenix experience. It's been tough in the archives. There's not a lot available, but what I find interesting is that much of the work that I did for my dissertation prepared me for this project, because when you really start sifting through, you realize that African Americans are everywhere. So case in point, in 1962, the Franklins, they were a couple from the Bay, an African-American couple from the San Francisco area. Their husband was he was a retired military man. Wife was, I believe, a real estate agent. They wind up purchasing a home maybe about 500 feet from Maryvale Hospital. At this time, it's very interesting the way that they purchased it. So there was a dealer between them and the original homeowner. The original homeowner sold it to an out-of-state buyer who did not have, or who had an anti-discrimination clause in his mortgage, while the in-state buyer did have a discrimination clause in his mortgage. So the Franklins were able to buy it because an out-of-state interest was able to help them basically evade racial restrictions. And they were one of the first Black families to move into the Maryvale area all the way back in 1962. And so when I think even of this project that I just shared with you all, you know, I wonder, what was the community that they were moving into like? What were their neighbors like? What were the community institutions like? And I think one of the things that we wind up seeing then is that African Americans were always represented in these neighborhoods. There have always been one or two or three. But what's interesting is the way in which African American communities wound up emerging and developing in places that proved to be often the most unstable in the valley. So I'm still trying to dig through, excavate, and figure out what this story is. But I think that the work I've done thus far is putting me on a path to make both of these projects make sense at the same time.
Thank you for sharing that. That sounds fantastic. I believe we have a question from Dr. Colleen Byron. Colleen, you want to unmute and ask your question?
I do, but of course you got me right when I put something in my mouth. I wanted to ask carefully about your choice of Maryvale in your research. And I want to say first that your presentation is really interesting, and particularly what you shared post-presentation on your research agenda, just in general, is really fascinating. And I wish you all the luck in the world digging out things out of small community archives, because you're right, that's where you're going to get the particular that in this case really will help you define or tell the story or tell a story of the African-American experience in the Phoenix metropolitan area, which that's a lot to do. That's a very, very ambitious research agenda. But my primary question is, why did you decide to start your telescoping out in Maryvale? It's a fascinating community. It's been a fascinating community for forever. But I'd like to hear why it's fascinating to you as opposed to why it's fascinating to me.
Absolutely. Almost a lifetime ago at this point, but when I was in grad school, I was fortunate enough to get a meeting with Dr. Phil Vandermeer over at ASU Tempe. And so I told him about my interest in doing an urban history of the Valley. And I asked him how to approach such a topic, because as you said, it's so sprawling. I mean, there's really just so much to do. He said to me, well, you just focus on a neighborhood. You find a neighborhood and you build it out that way. And so being a West Sider, I figured Maryvale would be a good place for me to start. It was familiar enough, and it was close to where I was at. It was a place that I felt like I already had a modicum of understanding about. So I began at the Burton Barr Library in the Arizona room, just trying to dig up what I could. And really this project has spilled out from there. What I found was that Maryvale is where much of this post-war stuff begins. I know that the East Valley is much larger than the West Valley in this sense, but Maryvale is a sort of proof of concept that allows for the master plan communities that are all over Maricopa County, all over the state at this point, to really take off. So in my sense, Maryvale, by understanding it, we understand out of what much of Central Arizona is coming out of. So I just decided to go to the source and build out from there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, Colleen. And we also have another question from Lowell Perry.
Okay. First of all, great presentation. Really enjoyed it. And part of this is really more of a comment. I wanted to congratulate you on really trying to do a deep dive on the Black experience here in this state. And we're in the process of doing more of that here in Yuma. At the Colorado River State Historic Park, we're engaging in some oral histories and video histories, and would love to pick your brain on it, maybe involve you in it. I put my information in the chat in a message to you. The folks were here before they were in Phoenix, so there's a lot of cool stuff that's going on, and what I'm learning as an African American who just located here maybe 4 years ago, even though I don't see many people that look like me, I know that there used to be a lot more, and most of the historians on here know that basically the Buffalo Soldiers ran this part of the state for many years until our fair government decided to kind of push them out after they had done all the work that they had done. So again, great presentation, and would love to connect with you about what we're doing here with, especially, you hear about Yuma, you hear about farming, but you never hear about Black farmers and ranchers and all here. And that is part of this history. So congratulations, man. Keep on keeping on.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
I really do.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. And unless there are any other questions, I think we're getting pretty close to time. So I'd like to thank Dr. Pratcher. That was a fantastic talk, and look forward to working with you more in the future. And if there's anything we can do to help you at AHS, please let us know.
AHS has been one of the first supporters of my research, from travel grants when I was working out of state. Even this opportunity right now, just being able to put things together. I don't want to get too personal, but Linda basically showed me how to use a reading log, Linda and Rebecca. So, I have a lot of love for AHS. Thank you all for the support over the years.
Great. All right, Dr. Pratcher, thank you so much for that presentation.